Namaste and good morning, everyone. Is everyone awake this morning? Yes? Okay. I'll start with a question. How many of you have relatives in the United States? Raise your hand. Okay, a good number of you. How many of you want to pursue higher studies in the United States? Wow. I know, things are a little crazy right now in America. How about Australia? There's a few that want to go to Australia. And the UK? Anywhere else other than India? Okay. This is interesting because each year, the first year there were a lot of hands up. This year there's fewer. And I'm hoping, well, let me ask one more question. How many of you follow politics anywhere? In the United States, in India, anywhere? In India, right? Okay. I encourage everyone, regardless of what field you're in, to follow politics because it's like the air in the room. It affects all of us, and if we're not engaged, then it could affect us in bad ways or in good ways. But especially when you live in a democracy, you have the power to shape how it affects you. So it is like the air in the room, and you can decide, even with your one vote, what the quality of that air is going to be. And I think that this topic, you may think, well, American politics, I have no desire of going to the United States, who cares? But the thing is that the world has become a much smaller place, and what happens there affects us here. What happens here can affect us there. So knowing about these intersections can allow us to better understand our own country by understanding political dynamics around the world. And maybe if you ever become a politician, anyone here want to become a politician? No? Maybe you'll change your mind in 5-10 years, you're still young. But if you do become a politician, you also can better understand the responsibility that you have as Indian citizens in how the world perceives India, and how in the diaspora, how people of Indian origin are also perceived, because it's all getting more and more intertwined. So I'll first just talk about my own journey. I was born and raised in the United States. My father left India in 1963 to pursue his master's education in chemical engineering, and then came back like a good Indian boy to find a nice Indian bride, and found my mother and got married, and then they settled back in the United States. So I was born and raised in the US, and I'm probably on the older end of what we would call second generation Indian Americans or Hindu Americans, because there were so few people coming from India to the United States. The US had limited immigration from Asia, and it wasn't until 1965, with the lifting of what law was called the Asian Exclusion Act, that specifically curtailed any sort of immigration from India, China, Japan, Korea, from all of Asia, that we see the Indian American population expanding from very few to maybe 40,000 around the 1980s to now about 5 million. Now, not all people of Indian origin are Hindu, and interestingly enough, not all Hindus are of Indian origin. So if you look at sampradayas like the Hare Krishna, for instance, right? Or Art of Living, or even the Brahma Kumaris, these are Hindu traditions or Hindu sampradayas that don't necessarily have all people of Indian origin who have become devotees. When it comes to politics, I am a lifelong Democrat. You'll get to understand what that means, but right now I feel like a political orphan. I don't know where I belong. And that is kind of what has inspired this talk. I'm also not alone. There's a lot of people of Indian origin and who are Hindu who feel like political orphans. So with that, I will begin. So what am I going to cover today? So first I'll talk about left and right and the origin and history of these terms as political terms. Then I'll talk about religion and politics in America, drilling down specifically into where Hindu American voters fit. Then we'll talk about Hindu Americans being caught in the middle, and then a path forward, because I don't like to end on a negative note. And caught maybe implies a little bit of negativity. So, before we can even understand what it means for Hindu Americans to be caught in the middle, we first need to understand a basic question. What do left and right actually mean in politics? So these terms didn't start in America or in India, where we oftentimes use these terms to describe, say, the Congress Party or Bajap, the BJP. They come from the French Revolution in the late 1700s. In French Parliament, people who supported the king and the church sat on the right side. And these are people who wanted to support the king, support the establishment, and so they were known as the right wing. And I'll argue that both right and left wing don't necessarily mean the same thing. They fundamentally differ. If we're talking about an Indian left-right paradigm and an American left-right paradigm, they mean different things. On the left, the original focus was anti-establishment, challenging old hierarchies, pushing for equality, secularism, and sovereignty of the people. So left-wing movements wanted to remove or reduce the power of the kings, of nobles, and of religious authorities. And over time, this side became associated with progressive reforms, for example, expanding voter rights, labor protections, welfare schemes, and with a belief that government should actively intervene to reduce inequality and protect vulnerable groups. And on the right, the focus was the opposite. The right defended the monarchy, the church, and existing social hierarchies. It favored order, tradition, and centralized power. And over time, right-wing politics came to be associated with conservatism, that is trying to preserve established values and institutions along with free markets, private property, and a smaller role for the state in the economy. So what does right-wing and left-wing in the American context mean today? So for Republicans, that's the right party. How many of you have heard of Republicans? Okay, now you have. And the left-wing party is Democrats. Who is the right-wing party here? BJP. Who is the left-wing party here? Congress Party, right. So I guess, roughly, I'm not going to say they're the same, but Congress, Democrats, Republicans, Bajap, but not the same at all, as you'll learn. So Republicans are the right party. They focus on limited government, depending on the issue, tax cuts, strong borders, conservative judiciary, socially conservative in a Judeo-Christian sense. Democrats are the left party. Economic safety nets is a focus, climate action, voting rights, equity and social justice, secularism, and socially liberal. So let's talk a little bit. So if you look at America today, it may seem obvious that then the religious side is the Republican Party. These two things are the symbol. The elephant is the Republican symbol, and the donkey is the Democratic symbol. I'm not quite sure what the history of that is. I'll look it up for next time. But the religious side is the Republicans, and the secular minority protecting side is assumed to be the Democrats, but it wasn't always this way. In the 1950s and 1960s, it didn't really matter what your religion was in terms of what political party you might associate with, whether you were a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, even an atheist. Anyone could be a Democrat or Republican. Your religion did not predict your role. This began to change in the 1970s. A key turning point was when Jimmy Carter, who was a Democrat, not a Republican, openly described himself as a born-again Christian. He was the first US president to kind of use this language. Now, previously, John F. Kennedy, who was Catholic, there were a lot of questions about whether a Catholic could be a president for the United States and not have some sort of split loyalty to the Vatican, because the United States, the Christianity that's practiced there is largely Protestant. So we did see some conversations about religion arising in the 60s, but not necessarily as a virtue, almost as a point of critique. But when Jimmy Carter basically used this language, he built a public image of being morally upright and very visibly religious. That moment basically helped political strategists on both sides realize that religious identity could be mobilized in electoral politics. So it set the stage for a much tighter link between religion and party that we see in the US from the 1980s onwards. So, since the 1980s, the rise of what's called the religious right has powerfully linked being Christian and being highly religious with the Republican Party. And that connection has only grown over time. And I'd say that especially in the last 10, 15 years, even more so. The religious right has been at the center of America's so-called culture wars. So the focus, they may have secular concerns, what is called kitchen table concerns, the economy, employment rates, taxes, all of those types of things. But the culture wars focus on issues like abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and the role of religion in public life. So these debates have really deepened partisan divides between conservative Christians who are generally pro-life and support marriage between a man and a woman, and more secular voters who are typically pro-choice and back what's called marriage equality, meaning that secular voters or the left party believe that if a couple is gay, two men should be able to marry one another, or two women should be able to marry one another. Now, according to a recent Pew Research survey, so Pew is one of the leading institutions that's based in the United States that takes surveys of different things, whether it's religious identities or political opinions. So a recent Pew Research survey found that 74% of Republicans identify as Christian, compared to 50% of Democrats. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but just because you're Christian doesn't mean that you believe in the same things. There's many different subsects or sub-traditions within Christianity, and of course, different social attitudes from liberal to conservative. Now, 40% of Democrats are religiously unaffiliated, showing how deeply faith and party identity have become intertwined in US politics. So when people talk about the religious right and white Christian nationalism, they often treat them as the same, but they're not, even though there's significant overlap. The religious right centers on theological and moral conservatism. It does include many white conservative Christians, along with some non-white Christians and other religious conservatives who might share the same moral agenda. White Christian nationalism, however, is a political ideology that claims that the U.S. should remain a Christian nation for white Christians. It seeks laws and institutions that would privilege conservative Christianity and maintain traditional white Christian dominance. Both do share some things. They share a vision of America's identity as a Christian nation under threat from secularism, pluralism, and multiculturalism. Both support Christianity's public prominence, so crosses, public displays of the Ten Commandments, Christian-inflected civics, and they favor weaker church-state separation. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So their constituencies and policy agendas also overlap. White conservative evangelicals form the core of both movements, typically endorsing abortion bans, opposition to LGBTQ rights, stricter immigration. So how many of you have been seeing news about H-1B visas? Right? Some of you have been seeing that. So there's been a lot of negative rhetoric towards people of Indian origin, and that very quickly veers into Hindu criticism. And so all of this kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric, they're also questioning now whether people born of immigrants in the United States deserve being citizens. So that would mean someone like me. Both my parents were Indian nationals. I happen to be born in the United States, and the United States Constitution guarantees that if you're born on that land, you automatically get citizenship. Now, that's not the case in every country. There's many countries in the Middle East, for instance, where even if you're born there, if you are of Indian origin or American citizenship, you can never be a citizen of those countries. So this is what kind of free secular democracies should function like, where if you're born there, you become a citizen of that country. So in short, white Christian nationalism is a powerful current within the religious right, but distinct from it. So you can think about like two concentric circles where the religious right is a larger circle, and then there's a smaller subset there where you have white Christian nationalism. So when I start talking about the far right, I'm referring to white Christian nationalism and not necessarily just the religious right, or not the religious right. So if the religious right and white Christian nationalists believe that America is a Christian country, is that an accurate statement? Is that a valid belief? So they both think that. Many people in the Indian American and Hindu American community will oftentimes say that. We as an organization, the Hindu American Foundation, have opposed legislation, have participated in Supreme Court cases to promote what is called the separation of church and state. Those words exactly are not found in the US Constitution, but it's a fundamental right provided by the US Constitution's First Amendment, that religious freedom means that the government will not favor any one religion over another, and also that the government won't interfere in any individual's ability to practice their religion. So we've been on that forefront of opposing it, but many people in our community, they're recent immigrants, they may not necessarily know the culture or the laws of the country. They oftentimes say, no, you should just keep your head down. This is a Christian country. So let's dig into that a little bit. Is that actually true? So when the Puritans, they were coming from Europe, and they were a sect of Protestantism, when they came to America in the 1600s, where Native peoples or Native Americans already lived and practiced their own spiritual traditions, they did so seeking religious freedom because they felt they were practicing a very pure form of Christianity, but they were being persecuted in Europe. So in colonial times, meaning 16 and 1700s, religion shaped nearly every aspect and every part of life. Many colonies had official churches. They even required religious tests for public office. And then came what's called the First Great Awakening. It was a revival movement that made Protestant belief even more central to public life. Now, during the Revolution, which is when all of the people who came to the United States, and they came from Europe, basically said, hey, we don't want the England or the crown to be dictating what we do here. So there was a war, right, between what became kind of the Americans and England, and for independence, to say, no taxation without representation, and a number of other things. So during that revolution and also the westward expansion, Protestant clergy often described independence and manifest destiny in overtly Christian terms. But by the late 1700s, the founding fathers of the United States, those who kind of led that separation and the revolution, and also drafted the US Constitution, which still remains the law of the land, recognized the need to protect religious freedom for all, not just one faith. So figures like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin weren't traditionally devout, but they leaned towards Enlightenment thinking and religious rationalism. And they agreed that civil rights should not depend on what God you pray to or what religious ideas that you espouse. So the First Amendment, which was ratified in 1791, enshrined that principle that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that no law respecting an establishment of religion means that the government can't endorse any particular religion, and that can manifest in a variety of things. There's no official church in the United States. The government cannot, and this is both at the federal and the state level and local level, they can't favor one religion over others. So that's what we call separation of church and state. What does it mean to favor a religion over others? It might mean that at the beginning of any legislative meeting, if you only allowed, say, Christian prayer, and you wouldn't let a Hindu come and lead, start the meeting with a shloka like Om Sahana Bhavatu or something, that would show that there's some bias and you're favoring one over the other. So that's not allowed. The other thing that's not allowed is that the state cannot interfere with the inner workings of any religious institution or any individual who might have a sincerely held belief. So the government, say for instance, there have been cases where schools had laws about having boys not being allowed to have long hair. Well, if you look at Native Americans, they have a tradition of long braids, or if you look at the Sikh community, who are not allowed to cut their hair. Something like that, that law, there would have to be some either like safety justification or some very compelling, important justification before the government could pass a law that interferes in a person's ability to practice their religion in that way. So that's kind of the twofold way in which religion is protected. So regardless of what the history is, first there were people of all different religions coming to the United States after the Puritans, and while Christianity did have an outsized impact on the society, when it came time to devising the laws, the founding fathers were very clear. And we also know from this quote from Thomas Jefferson that they had even us in mind, right? There might have been a handful. You have to remember that the United States was a British colony at the same time that India was a British colony. So there were many, there's now more and more historical evidence coming to fore that there were people who were Indian and likely Hindu who were in America from as far back as the 1700s, maybe even not the 1600s, but the 17 and 1800s. So they very much envisioned a country that would have laws that would protect people of all religious backgrounds. Now let's get into kind of the crux of that was all kind of background on what does left-right mean, what does the American legal system look like in terms of its relationship with religion. So the American and left paradigm doesn't neatly translate to the Indian left-right paradigm. But even though it doesn't, American media, academia, and activists use the term right-wing to describe India's current government, and that could be accurate on some issues, but not necessarily the same. And sometimes they use it in a way to conjure up a particular fear or suspicion, because all of these three arenas that I talked about, academia, media, and activism, the most influential are leftist. Academics, media, and academics and activists. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. So this is a comparison between the American right and the Indian right. So in India, the contemporary center-right often describes its mission, and this is not my assessment, I'm just going based on what they describe themselves as. Its mission is rooted in a civilizational ethos, a worldview that for millennia embraced a diversity and an astounding array of ethnicities, tribes, and regional cultures and languages, but yet shared broad ideas about a cosmic order, self-realization, duty, and harmony between humanity and nature. So in theory, this vision celebrates unity within diversity grounded in spiritual pluralism. In the United States, the religious right frames its mission differently. It seeks to restore a traditional biblically inspired moral order, one it believes that secular modernity has eroded, and that maybe even the Indian right might feel that as well, at least in the interpretation of what secularism means here. A more extreme wing, the white Christian nationalism, goes further, arguing that America should remain a nation defined by whiteness and Christian identity. Now, despite their different roots, both the Indian right and the American religious right share certain impulses: a strong sense of national identity, valorization of military strength and internal security, and faith in economic liberalization, so lower taxes, minimal regulation, and smaller welfare states. That's different, I think, in India, where the welfare state, just given the immense population and income disparities, that welfare state is less of a concern here in India than it is in the United States, where they really, really oppose it. So each in its way blends spiritual memory with modern nationalism to define who belongs and what value should give the nation's future. And now let's contrast the American and Indian left. American progressives aim to expand equality rights, material security through active government, dismantling hierarchies tied to race, gender, class, and other identities. They frame America's moral project as liberating marginalized minority groups and push for equity. I use the word equity and not equality, meaning that they are pushing for equal outcomes as opposed to equal opportunities in many instances, and redistributive justice, that if in the past one group benefited, so now they should now no longer benefit, and the groups that didn't benefit should. So it's not necessarily looking at everyone being put on the same playing field, but to kind of, through policy, right historical wrongs, even though today that might not necessarily benefit all people. Radical leftists often portray white Christians, especially white evangelicals, as a reactionary power bloc that is at the top of the racial and gender hierarchy, while distinguishing them from progressive Christians or Christians of color. Ordinarily, they would view people of Indian origin or Hindus as minorities in need of protection. But this is where the Indian left comes in, because Hindus, for sure, and people of Indian origin in the United States have succeeded tremendously, economically and educationally. So that already kind of reduces, in some sense, the sense that Indian Americans or Hindu Americans are minority, even though we make up less than 1.5% of the population and look different, follow a different religious tradition or culture, and can face discrimination in the workplace or in education. This is why the Indian left focuses on the exceptions rather than the rules, or the norm, so to speak. So leading to a political tribalism that slices and dices on the basis of language, ancestry, class. But in India, they're primarily borrowing Western political ideologies and majority-minority paradigms that are a misfit for India's history or unmatched diversity. The result is basically a self-loathing class that detests an imagined Hindu majority and embraces a similarly imagined oppressed minority. So in India, for instance, the majority, you can say, are Hindu. Minorities are Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Jains, Sikhs, and others, right? However, historically, the majority, at different times through colonization, were colonized by predecessors of today's minorities, right? So that already is unique, where the majority was not the one in power from time immemorial. So that's what I mean by a historical misfit. Now, how does that end up leading to Hindu Americans being caught in the middle? So the South Asian American left, That is basically the avatar of Indian leftists in the United States. They actually tend not to identify as Indian because the coalition includes people from Pakistan, from Bangladesh primarily, and sometimes Nepal. South Asian American leftists have embedded themselves in the American progressive or the far left movement, and they frequently frame Hindu Americans as proxies for Hindu supremacy, Brahminical patriarchy, privilege, bigotry, Islamophobia. And so Hindu Americans, basically from their worldview, are almost like the equivalent of white Christians, even though we're in America, even though we're a religious and ethnic minority, even though we make up less than 1.5% of the population. Now, the average community member in America, the Hindu American community member, is not asking for special treatment. They're just asking for equal treatment. But what you'll see when I talk about the impact that South Asian American leftists have had on policy, they're actually pushing for policies that could harm the broader Hindu American and Indian American community. Even though they are a part of it, they don't care because they are dragging political grievances that they might have here to the United States and trying to litigate them there without actually acknowledging the very drastic differences between being a person of Indian origin and Hindu in America and that of being in India and being Hindu. So Hindu Americans vary in views, both social and political, but what these leftists do is they code as conservative or Hindutva, they code things like being vegetarian as being conservative, while in America, usually vegetarianism might be something that is espoused or adopted by American leftists because they see it as an environmentally positive practice. Or something like the Uniform Civil Code. How many of you know what the UCC is? Anyone? Some of you? Okay. Uniform Civil Code is something that has been a political, a political goal of the BJP, at least, of having laws, one set of laws that apply to everyone. Currently, especially in the realm of family law, India has separate Muslim laws, Hindu laws, and Christian laws, right? So Uniform Civil Code. Now in the United States, secularism in the United States does not mean separate laws. It means one law for all people. Now, historically, Democrats would be very supportive of that, right? When I talked about religion and politics, Democrats don't want government and religion to mix as much as the religious right would. The religious right wants religion and politics to mix, and specifically Christianity and politics to mix. So traditionally, the Democrats would be supportive of something like the UCC, at least when we talk about it as a political legal principle. However, Indian leftists oppose it because of minorityism, or that kind of adaptation they've made of a majority-minority framework and Western ideologies. And so they take advantage, the South Asian American leftists take advantage of American ignorance and a general kind of detest or suspicion of any right-wing parties that the left-leaning media, academia, and activist circles already espouse, and use that as a kind of entry point to then start attacking Hindu Americans. And so now let's talk a little bit about actual Hindu American political identity before I start talking about what do those attacks look like. So Hindu Americans have leaned traditionally strongly democratic overall, but there's been meaningful ideological and partisan diversity with a noticeable growing Republican conservative segment, in spite of the religious right. I should also make a point to say that while there is this religious right and Christian nationalist far right, there's also moderate Republicans who aren't necessarily pushing for a country that is only for Christians. And so when it comes to tax policies, strong borders, less regulation, those are all secular concerns. So there's Indian Americans and Hindu Americans who espouse those types of policy solutions to whatever issues are being discussed. So support for Democrats declined from 56 to 47. That's a 9% change in a relatively short period of time. There's also generational differences there, where first generation of Hindus born in the US and therefore align, or second generation that align more with an American identity may still vote Democrat, while older Indian Americans and Hindu Americans vote Republican. There's a gender gap there, with more men having turned to support Trump. And the one thing that's clear is Indian American voting behavior is heavily influenced by policy platforms rather than personal attributes. So many oppose the Republican Party due to the stances on abortion, intolerance of minorities, and ties to Christian evangelism. But on economic issues, there's alignment with the Republican Party in terms of inflation and jobs. Those are all top policy concerns. And then U.S.-India relations, even though it seems like that's the topic that everyone discusses in living rooms and parlors, 59%, this is during Harris and Trump, so this last election, 59% of Indian Americans trusted Harris more than Trump to handle U.S.-India relations. And I think we kind of see the worst fears having manifested just over the past few weeks, with tariffs jumping from 50% to now 18%. So when we look at are people, so this is just talking about voters. How about people who are actually running for office? This is a space that the Hindu American community is just beginning to make inroads in. We've succeeded in every other sector, whether it's medicine or tech, entrepreneurship, the hotel and motel businesses, and all of that sort of stuff. So at the federal level, there are 4 self-identified Hindu Americans elected into office. We have Ro Khanna, Raja Krishnamurthy, Sri Thanedar, and Suhas Subramaniam. They are all Democrats. There's Ami Bera and Pramila Jaipal, 2 more people of Indian origin, but they don't necessarily, even though they were raised Hindu, they don't necessarily identify as Hindu publicly. You have a handful of high-profile Hindu Republicans. You have Vivek Ramaswamy. How many of you have heard of that name? No? Okay. Vivek Ramaswamy ran for U.S. president. And then now he's running for governor of Ohio, which is kind of a mid-sized state in the United States. And then we have Tulsi Gabbard. And remember early on I talked about that not all Hindus are of Indian origin. Well, Tulsi Gabbard is a good example of that. She is Samoan background, born and raised in, I think, Hawaii. And she represented, she was a Democrat before. She changed parties recently. She also ran for president as a Democrat, and she recently changed parties and now is an appointee, and she is the Director of National Intelligence for the Trump administration. And you also have state representatives like Neeraj Antani, who was the youngest state representative in Ohio and ran on the Republican ticket. So Indian Americans remain split in their views over these individuals. So whether they are of Indian origin or not, that is not the sole reason that someone would support them. They would still go to what political party represents their interests the best. But on the whole, I'd say that the community tends to be centrist. They don't take extremist views on either, and that's what kind of leads to being caught in the middle, but there's also opportunities there, which I'll cover. So in the American context, both the far left and far right have shown hostility towards Hindus, and for different reasons. So I'll go over all of those. On the far right, segments rooted in white Christian nationalism and xenophobia see Hinduism as foreign and pagan, incompatible with a supposed Judeo-Christian civilization. Hindu temples, festivals, even our accents and names are coded as un-American, and Hindus are cast as stealing jobs from real Americans with strange and dirty practices. Even conversion to Christianity doesn't necessarily erase suspicion, because race and a desire for segregation still shape those who are seen as fully belonging. On the left, especially South Asian progressive circles, Hindus are often viewed mainly through Indian politics, and so Hindu Americans get collapsed into Hindu nationalists, being upper caste privileged, or diaspora extensions of the BJP and Hindutva, and as somehow a danger to progressive values. So what are some of the common tropes? And there's something called a horseshoe theory. What a horseshoe theory means is that, weirdly enough, you would think that white Christian nationalists on one side and South Asian American leftists would never agree on anything, except for the fact that they do agree on their detest of Hindu Americans. That is called a horseshoe theory, where basically the two ends somehow end up meeting. And unfortunately, this is where they're meeting, and we're caught in the middle. So I'll quickly go over some examples of some of the tropes that we see online. I also want to make an important point here, because this is where we kind of get into some really ugly, negative stereotypes that are promoted. It represents the extremes. There's still an entire middle of Americans who value pluralism, who value the promise of America, which is supposed to be a land where people are all treated equal regardless of their ethnic or racial or religious background, or even their sexual orientation. And so the reason we highlight these is that if we don't speak up now, their influence could start seeping into young people in the next generation. It could radicalize those people who are isolated, and that's why it's important to raise alarm bells about them, even though they represent just a very vocal minority on both sides. So what are some of the types of tropes that we see? That Hindu American success is a scam. Hindus are born bigots. You'll see a lot of overlapping themes here. Hindus are superstitious, gross, and primitive. Hindus can't be trusted here, and Hindus are a threat to progressive or Christian values. So let me get into some of the examples. So Hindu American success is a scam. What does this mean? The trope is basically that Hindu American achievement is treated as unearned, that it's either a product of caste privilege or white adjacency. Because we are successful as a community, we don't require protection anymore, even though we are 1.5% of the population. And the proximity to power on the far left, or visa gaming or fraud and job theft on the right. So the intended effect, basically, they converge in portraying Hindu Americans as illegitimate beneficiaries of a system, either privileged oppressors or foreign usurpers, but in both cases undeserving of the success. And this strips Hindu Americans of minority legitimacy and moral standing when we start speaking out on our concerns about discrimination or equal protection. Then, Hindus are born bigots. What's the trope here? That Hindu identity is portrayed as inherently supremacist, often linked with caste, fascism, or intolerance towards minorities. It paints Hindu Americans as inherently bigoted, while right-wing narratives recycle this image as proof that Hindus bring a uniquely corrupt, hierarchical, foreign heathen culture to the West. The intended effect here is to normalize suspicion of Hindu religious and community life, making Hindu spaces, advocacy, and even everyday practices automatically suspect in schools, workplaces, or politics. You also see here a denial of Hindu phobia. So if we're facing anti-Hindu hatred and we're trying to raise it, you have South Asian leftists who say anti-Hindu hatred is not a thing. One, they already have kind of authority. They'll say, oh, well, as a Hindu, I am saying that Hindus are dangerous. Well, that already then makes it difficult for everyday Hindu Americans to oppose these types of hateful rhetoric. So here's an example of our culture and us being kind of the tropes showing that Hindu rituals, temples, and deities are caricaturized as dirty, irrational, and pagan. From social media mockery of festivals and customs to Christian nationalist depictions of Hindu temples as idolatrous pollution. And oftentimes this kind of echoes the leftist derision through a lens of Christian supremacy. And the intended effect is to pressure Hindu Americans to hide or kind of diminish their visible practice in order to be seen as modern, employable, and socially acceptable. And it feeds into an internalized shame. This really has a drastic effect on younger generations. Then, Hindus can't be trusted here. This trope basically suggests that civic engagement, temple building, or advocacy on US-India issues, or even ordinary American issues, they get framed as evidence of dual loyalty or ideological subversion, while the white nationalist rhetoric casts Hindu Americans as permanent outsiders who are reshaping the real America. And the intended effect here is that both narratives question Hindu Americans' belonging and loyalty, framing us as either dangerous proxies for a foreign state or as civilizational outsiders who can never fully be American. And we have Hinduism, this is the last one. Hinduism is a threat to progressive and traditional values, not a faith. So this is that on the left, Hinduism is framed as inherently at odds with equality and liberation. And on the right, as a pagan civilizational rival undermining Judeo-Christian America, with both sides treating Hindu presence as something that must be contained rather than accommodated. And so this justifies sidelining Hindu perspectives on pluralism and debates on policy, and it recodes a minority religious community as either proto-fascists or anti-Christian or anti-Muslim, therefore underserving both full inclusion and protection. So unfortunately, it's not just in the realm of rhetoric. We've also seen implications coming through policy. So on the left, we have what's called transnational repression bills, where South Asian leftists are asking for laws that would put under suspicion specifically Hindu Americans who are opposing, say, Khalistani separatism, which has a lot of support in America, that we are somehow agents of the Indian government and should be monitored, policed, and questioned. And so if we raise issues, and why are we raising these issues? Because a lot of Khalistani separatists are actually attacking Hindu mandirs in America. So if we want to raise those issues, now all of a sudden we're not raising it because we're trying to protect our temples, but because we're agents of the Indian government, which we're not. Then there's caste laws. There are, I've talked about this last time I was here, laws in which they're trying to insert caste protections or caste prohibitions, similar to the Indian system, except that those are not the realities in the United States. As second generation and third generation Hindu Americans, they have no conception of what caste means. And in India, at least, you have an administrative category. Either you have certain government privileges or recognitions, or you don't. From the right, you see a lot of Christianity being pushed through public schools, whether it's a display of the Ten Commandments, curricula that say that the stories found in the Bible are history, but the stories found in Hindu texts are fairy tales, and also calls to halt not just H-1B immigration, but birthright citizenship. So how is all of this misinformation perpetuated? It's happening through the media, online, and also through school textbooks. And what this basically does overall is that it makes people uncomfortable in their own skin. It makes children question their identity, regardless of how many generations you're in America. I walk in, my name is Suhag Shukla, my skin tone is different, I eat different types of food, the music I listen to is different. I want to hold on to all of those things because they give me value in my life, and I want my children to carry that on. I don't want my parents taking the option of pursuing a better life for their family to mean that I leave my culture behind. So I have passed it on to my children. They want to pass it on to theirs. But if the broader American society makes it a liability to be Hindu, that's a problem. And so that is one of the reasons that we call these things out. Hate crimes have been on the rise as a result of this rhetoric because people do get influenced. So you have the policy impact, you have the social impact. And there have been studies that show that online hatred and hateful rhetoric can translate to on-ground violence. This is very true for the Jewish community. We don't want to, so far we haven't seen any acts of violence, at least from white Christian nationalists against Hindus, but we don't want to wait for that to happen. So, again, now I'm going to end now, but a positive note. I talked about this earlier, that what I covered are the extremes, right? 43% of American voters are independent, so they're not necessarily tied to either one of these parties, and certainly not the extremes. What do the extremes, how are the extremes measured? Well, that they only make up 19% of Americans. So we shouldn't also let some of this rhetoric and some of the hate skew our perception of reality, that the vast majority of people don't agree with the haters on both sides. And we also need that perspective so that we don't feel demoralized in taking action. And so what can Hindu Americans do? What do I tell the community what we need to do? Is first, speak up. Too often in our community, we tend to be passive, and Ramji mentioned that. We don't want to draw attention. I mean, I think recently some immigration attorney said, Hindus should plant more trees to be more acceptable. No, and diminish our practices. No, we should not do that. We should continue practicing. We should continue sharing the positive values of our tradition, which is pluralistic, open. We have wonderful teachings about how to take care of nature, which could help affect the climate change crisis, etc. Get involved, get more involved in politics, not less involved. And be informed as a voter. If there are politicians who are promoting this type of hateful rhetoric, show up and vote for their opponent, right? These are the types of advice that we're giving Hindu Americans. I thank you all for your attention. I know this was a lot of information, but I hope that you took something away from this. And maybe now you're thinking about ways in which maybe there are some comparisons with the political realities here. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. And that also answers why no one raised their hands, right? When I asked how many of you want to go to the United States. I think that President Trump is surrounded by many people who hold very anti-immigrant views that are just plain racist. They are not looking at the whole picture. I think Indian students have been the pipeline to American success in technology. I think it's very short-sighted. It's basically putting a nail in the coffin in terms of America's ability to lead on the technology front, and STEM generally. And so I hope things change. I know that there are many people in the Hindu and Indian American communities that are lobbying the government to not do this. A lot of universities as well, because Indian students and foreign students coming to the United States represents millions of dollars of profit for these universities. And Indian students are coming well prepared to excel in their master's programs. They're joining startups, they're starting startups, they are supporting companies like Google and Microsoft and all the major, Tesla, X, all of the major tech companies. And so I think it'll be a combination of universities, tech companies that push back on these policies. And while that curtailment is there is definitely the need to talk about fraud in our immigration system. The United States immigration system is broken. That is for sure. I think that we as Americans should be having that conversation without where immigrants come from being a part of that conversation, because that's when it veers into racism and bigotry. We should be talking about, are Americans getting jobs? That's important, because you can't have a populace where you can't employ American citizens or even permanent residents. But we also can't ignore the fact that many of the people who have become citizens or green card holders are foreign nationals who came to the country, who are now giving back to the country and have made America what it is today. So it's something we're watching closely. I'm hoping that we get kind of the collective will in the US Congress to reform the immigration system so it becomes a merit-based system that rewards people who want to come to America to study hard, work hard, and give back to the country. That's and follow its laws. That, to me, are the basics of a good immigration system. But so far, we have pushed for immigration reform for the better part of 20 years, and Congress just doesn't want to deal with it. But I think at this point, with what happened because they didn't deal with it is what we're seeing today. The types of raids that we're seeing on American cities, where if you're brown, I've basically told family members, make sure you have a copy of your passport on your phone. I have one. I was born and raised there. I shouldn't have to. No American should have to. Shouldn't matter what color my skin is to have my Americanness questioned. So because of the lack of attention to this issue, now we're seeing a overcorrection, and a really horrible one at that, where 2 American citizens have died and many have been hurt. So we have a real challenge in the United States, and we have to grapple with it as Americans, and I hope we do it sooner than later. That's a difficult question. Well, one thing is that every term is only 4 years, right? So when are you graduating? By that time, the political situation in the United States may change. I think you should keep all options on the table. I still think that the United States offers unmatched opportunity for personal growth, career growth, and everything. I think that the legal structure that's set in place, when in its ideal form, leads to great personal and human flourishing. I'm not saying that it's perfect by any means. We're seeing that today. I would keep all options open. You need to look at not just where you're going to get the best quality education for what you want to do, but where is there going to be a pathway to then get actual experience in that field, and the best experience. You may eventually want to come back to India. And I think that right now India is rising, right? And so I'm actually seeing more and more people who want to either maybe go abroad, gain some experience and bring it back, or they go abroad and they stay abroad. Everyone has their personal reasons as to why they pick one path or the other. But I would say keep all your options open, and depending on timing. We're now entering the 2nd year of this current presidential term. I think that the next set of elections will show whether the American public is fed up with some of the excesses, especially on immigrants, and that could change things in terms of where's the best place to go. But as an American, I love my country. I also love India. And like I said, I think that America offers great promise, but it's imperfect.